How is everyone? So today's our second session, and today I'm going to talk about what chess pieces are and how they move. Okay, so let me start with a pawn. I'm going to grab a pawn and put it here at the center of the board, or on the second row here. And this pawn, you will notice, is on the E2 square. Okay, so how I got that is that I came here on the columns and I looked at the E column, and then here I went on the rows, and this is the second row. Okay, now chess pawns, when it is their first move, remember when you start the game, all the pawns are in the second rank, right? So if it is your turn and you want to move a pawn, you have a choice that you can move the pawn up one square to here, or you can move the pawn up two squares to here, okay? Note that you can only do two squares if it is your first move. In other words, if your pawn is already here, you can only go one more square. You cannot go two more squares from here and jump, right? The pawn can only jump on its first move, going two squares, okay? Um, Other than that, you can only go one square. Now, pawn is the only piece in a chessboard that once you move it, you cannot bring it back. Okay, so if I go forward here, there is no way for me to come backwards. I can only go forward or I can keep the pawn here. If you want to just move your pawn, you can only go in this straight fashion. All right, you cannot move a pawn to the sides. You can only go forward. However, you can take pieces with a pawn. And the way you can take pieces is in diagonal. So you can take a piece here, or you can take a piece here, okay? The pawn can only exert its force in one square in the diagonal, okay? So if I had a piece on this C4 square here, I would not be able to take it with a pawn. But if I had a piece here in the D3 square, then I would be able to take it with a pawn, okay? Now, let's say that it is my move, and I have moved my pawn here. I have gone two squares up. Now, if there is a piece here on this D5 square, I would be able to take it. And if there is a piece here on this F5 square, I would be able to take it, right? However, I could not take a piece that is standing right in front of me on this E5 square. Okay, so let's say if I had a black pawn here, I would not be able to take it. If I had a black pawn here, however, I would be able to take it and my pawn would move this way. Okay, so that's really the extent of movement that a pawn can do. The only other thing you need to know about the pawn is the en passant rule. Okay, so remember at the start of the game, all of the pawns are in the second row for white and in the seventh row for black. Okay, now let's say that my pawn was here, I moved it here, and then again I moved it another square here, and now it is black's turn to move, right? If black brings his pawn here, his or her pawn here, then I would be able to take it, right? But if, let's say, that the black is still here and I'm here, and black decides to go two moves. It's their first move with the pawn, so they're able to go two moves. In this case, I can do what's known as the en passant and take this pawn. And so this pawn will now be gone. Okay? So this is known as the en passant rule. And en passant is the French word for in passing, which means that I can take this pawn as it is passing. Okay, I can only do this while this pawn is moving. If I didn't take it that move and I moved another, let's say if I had another pawn here and I brought this pawn here instead, I cannot take this pawn here anymore. Okay, now let's talk about the next move, the next piece. The next piece we can talk about is the rook. Remember, the rooks are always on the side of the board. So this is how they are for white, and this is how they are for black. Okay. Now I'm going to put the rook here at the center, and I'm going to get rid of these rooks here so that I don't have to worry about them. Whatever I will discuss for this one rook would be correct for all the other rooks. Okay. The rook can move in these ranks and in these files. A rook cannot go diagonally, but it can go this way, it can go this way, it can go this way, and it can go this way. Okay, So this is the extent of a rook's movement, and the rook can take anything on its way while it is moving. So let's say black has a pawn here. My rook can go here and take this pawn. And now my rook will be placed here and the pawn will be gone. So if you think about how many squares a rook can cover, if a rook is here at the center, I can cover 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. So in total, I can cover 14 squares if I have the rook in the center. Now, the next piece we can cover is a knight. So again, knights are here for white and knights are here for black. And I'm going to put a knight here at the center and get rid of all the other knights. Okay, so you might know this already because this is somewhat famous, but knights move in an L-shaped movement. Okay, so if you have a knight here, you can move it there, you can move it here, you can move it to this square, you can move it to this square, and same on this side. So the knight can go here and it can go here, okay? Notice the L movement. It looks like, well, if you look at this one here, going from this E4 square to this F2 square, it is as if you've written a capital L letter, okay? Now, if your knight is at the center, you can see that it can cover 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 squares. Okay, compare this to the rook, which could cover 14 squares. So the rook has a much more, much broader range of action compared to the knight, right? However, the knight is the only piece that can jump across other pieces. Okay, so let's say this is the start of the game. I have a knight here and I have a rook here. And let's say I have my two pawns here. And of course, the rest of the board is also, but let's forget about the rest of the board. Let's say the rest of the board is also, everything is in place. Now, this rook cannot move to the left because it is being blocked by the knight. It cannot move forward because it is being blocked by the pawn. The knight, however, it can jump and come here, or it can jump and go here. And it is not restricted by the fact that this pawn is standing in front of it. Now let's go to the next piece, which is a bishop. Again, remember the bishops are, white has two bishops, they go here and here, and black has two bishops, they go here and here, okay? I'll get rid of the rest of these bishops and just keep one bishop here at the center and get rid, actually I will keep this other bishop as well. Okay, so one thing you will notice about this bishop is that now I have a bishop that is in the light squares, and then I have another bishop that is sitting here in the black squares. Okay, let me bring this two bishops together. Okay, now bishops can move in diagonals. Okay, so if I have this white bishop here, I could cover this area, I could cover this area over here, I could cover this area at the bottom, and then I could cover this area over here. However, because the bishop can only move in a diagonal, the light squared bishop can only take pieces in diagonals that have light squared and light squares in diagonals, and a black squared bishop can also take pieces that are only in the black squares. Okay, so what does this mean? That means that if you lose one of these bishops, you will not have the ability to use it to, for example, take pieces on the black square. However, the two bishops together are quite strong because they could cover a whole lot of squares together. However, unlike a knight, a bishop can also not jump over other pieces. So let's say if I have a bishop sitting here, and let's say this other bishop doesn't exist. So I have my light squared bishop sitting here, and it is covered by these two pawns. This bishop actually cannot do anything right now. It is completely blocked by these two pawns. So what you want if you have a bishop is to give it freedom to move. If I have this pawn moving now, then this bishop can cover all of these pieces. Okay, so that's why you have to get your pawns out of the way of your other pieces at the start of the game when you start the opening, so that these other pieces can develop and come out and exert their force. So let's go to the next piece now. We've talked about pawns, we've talked about rooks, knights, and bishops. And so the next thing we can talk about is the queen. Now, this is the most valuable piece on the chessboard. Okay. Um, a queen, white has one queen and black has one queen. Okay. Now, let's say that I put this white's queen here at the center and I get rid of the black's queen for now. And if you think about queen's movement, it is in a way a combination of what a rook can do and what a bishop can do, which is what makes it so valuable. So, what can a rook do? A rook can go in this way, in this way, and also horizontally, right? So it can go vertically and it can go horizontally. Now, think about what a bishop can do. A bishop can go diagonally. So a queen can cover here, it can cover here, it can cover here, and it can cover here. Okay, so now you can probably already see that this is a lot more squares compared to what any of the other pieces we discussed can do. Now, one other thing that I should probably discuss here is the relationship between the pawn and the queen. So a pawn that goes to the end of the board. So let's say this queen is not here. And let's say that you have your pawn coming here, going all the way. And if a pawn gets to the other side of the board, so let's say that you're white, you moved your pawn from the second row here and went all the way. Once you hit the eighth row, then you can turn this pawn into anything you want. Okay, so you can get here and say, oh, I want to turn this pawn to a queen. Okay, normally what happens is when people get here, they turn their pawn to the queen because the queen is the most valuable piece. However, this is not, you don't have to do that. You can get the pawn here to the end and say, I want to turn this pawn to a knight. Okay, you can turn this into anything other than a pawn and a king. Okay, so your pawn can be a rook, a king, a knight, a bishop, and a queen if you want. Okay, and the final piece we need to talk about is the king. Okay, in a way, everything on the chessboard is there to either protect the king or to attack the other side's king. Okay, so this is the white's king, and each player has one king, of course. And so let's just move the white king here to the center and get rid of the black king. Now the king can go here. It can cover one square into any direction. So a king can take all of these squares. And now if you quickly count this, this is 8 squares. So that's actually a good amount of force that it can provide for you. However, usually the king can come under attack. And I will talk about that when we talk about the checkmate and checks and checkmates. So that is something to consider. You usually would want to protect your king. And so you do not bring a king out inside like in the opening moves of a game. So normally you have your king here and it is being covered by pawns, and you would want to try to protect it as much as you can, and sometimes you even try to take it outside of the center of the board so that you can protect it. Okay. Now that you know how the pieces move, I will also tell you what is commonly known to be the value of each piece. So it is one thing I want you to keep in mind is that these values are dynamic. And even though I think as humans, we like to have a numbers so that we can compare them. It can change depending on the game. Okay, and I will give you an example very shortly. However, usually pieces are considered in terms of how many equivalents of pawns they are. So one pawn is considered just one in terms of value. You can say that one pawn is just one, has one value. And then let's talk about the next piece, that is the knight. Knight is considered to have a value equal to 3 or 3 pawns. Okay. The same thing with the bishop. Bishop is also considered to be equivalent of 3 pawns in terms of its value. Okay, so let's say that I'm playing an opponent and all the other pieces are wiped out, and I have my king and a knight and a bishop, and my opponent has their king and just a bishop. In this case, I am 3 pawns off in a sense because the bishops cancel out each other, but the knight has a value equal to 3 pawns. So I'm essentially 3 pawns off, or I'm a knight up. Now, the next piece that we need to talk about is, let's get rid of all of these, is the rook. The rook is usually considered to be equivalent of 5 pawns. And finally, the queen is considered to be the equivalent of 9 pawns. Let me put it here at the center. And this can be equivalent of 9 pawns. So you can see that there is a hierarchy here in a way. The pawns are the least important because they're equivalent of 1, whereas the knights and the bishops are equivalent of 3, the rook is equivalent of 5, and the queen is equivalent of 9. We don't place a value on the king because you cannot really take an opponent's king. You can try to give it checks or checkmate it, but you cannot really take it. So that's the only piece that does not have intrinsic value when we count these. And again, I will talk about that, how to checkmate in a follow-up video. But one thing I want to tell you is, you know, let's say that you have these pieces here, just to tell you that these values are quite relative. So I told you earlier that the knight and the bishop both are equivalent to 3 pawns, right? However, let's say I'm in this position where I have my bishop trapped inside between these 2 pawns. So the bishop can go here and can go here. However, in this case, it cannot move at all because both of these squares are covered by a pawn, right? Whereas the knight can go here and it can go here and it doesn't care if there are pawns here, right? So in this situation, you cannot really say that a bishop is more is equal or stronger. It looks like based on this position, it looks like the knight is stronger, right? Now, this is of course the opening position, but things can change, or you can have similar situations inside the game. So usually if the position is such that you cannot move the bishop, but the knight can go around, then that knight is better. However, if you place both of these at the center, now, of course, you will see that the bishop can cover more squares than a knight can. So keep in mind, every one of these values is relative and depends on your position, but it mentally helps to have some value in mind for your chess pieces. So that's all we needed to know for chess movement, the movement of pieces and their values. On my follow-up video, I will tell you what is check and what is checkmate and how you can win the game. Thanks so much for listening, and please tune in for the next video.